and it's why we won the war. Not really, but that it was really helpful. And these companies made a ton of money with C8 because they sold it and they slapped that sucker on everything. But World War II ended, and they needed to find another way to monetize this. They were like, all right, what can we do? What can we do with C8 now that we have it? This is really cool. It pulls water away. And so let's put it on pots. Let's put it on pans. Let's spray this stuff. And this is basically the birth of non-stick. How many of you have ever used something non-stick? How many of you, wait. A more important question. How many of you have ever used stick? Right? You just use straight stainless steel, right? You use cast iron. You killed something, right? You killed. I fight so hard. This is unrelated to my message, but I fight so hard to use stainless. And I just don't know. I don't know the people who do it well. You are my heroes. So anyway, they put it on pots and pans. They put it on carpet. Because, come on, think about this. You have a carpet that you can't get a stain on? That's amazing, right? They put it on everything. Wallpaper, tables, plastics, everything you could think of. Pacifiers, binkies, everything. Those are the same thing. They just put it on all kinds of stuff because it was just really, really useful. In fact, I have an ad. This is really fun because it's from the 50s, right? And it works on your pan, works on your ironing board, right? Okay, but here's the deal. While they were making C8, they decided that C8 was not a great name. They renamed it Teflon. How many of you have ever heard of Teflon before? Okay, some of you have heard of Teflon. Some of you that's okay. Because here's what happened. What happened was that the people in the factory making Teflon started to get sick. And so the assembly line workers who are literally using their hands and breathing in Teflon fumes all day start to get very sick. In fact, a few of them over a period of 6 months end up in the hospital, and they go, okay, wait. There's something that doesn't feel right about this. So here's what they do. They start to perform some tests on animals, mice and things like that. And they go, okay, the mice test came back, and it gives mice kidney cancer and liver cancer, affects their babies, and does some things. I'm sure it's safe for people. And so here's what they do. They say, they decide to give a group of employees cigarettes, and they don't tell them that half of them are laced with Teflon and the other half are not. And so they monitor the ones who smoked the Teflon, and sure enough, believe it or not, everyone who had a Teflon cigarette wound up in the hospital within 6 hours. Now that's really interesting, right? And they go, okay, this might be bad. But nobody's straight smoking Teflon, so we think we're okay. But then they started to notice that any women who worked in the Teflon line who were pregnant started to have pregnancy complications. And they still decided, well, you know what, it's only a small percentage, so we don't need to really do much about this. So when the EPA came in and said, hey, is Teflon dangerous? They said, listen, we have done a ton of studies on Teflon. Internally, human studies, animal studies, it's fine. And so the EPA, the government, was just like, all right, sounds cool, man, we trust you, right? They're just like, all right, guys, that's awesome, love it, that's great. So they were like, yeah, run with it. So these companies were able to dump Teflon in the lakes and river systems in West Virginia around the factories that they were producing Teflon. They were able to lock it in drums and throw it into the ocean. They were able to do quite a lot of things through the 40s and the 50s. and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, all the way into the 2000s. And in the 2000s, somebody finally decided to sue one of these companies. And they had enough gall to say, hey, we want all of your records. And when they went through all of the records of the company, they saw test after test after test after study after study after study from inside, in which they knew it was poisonous to people, and they kept making it. In fact, they kept firing the guy who was at the top of the research team, who would be like, hey, we just found out this is poisonous. And they're like, out of a job, sucker. And so for decades, Teflon was poured into water, was sprayed on everything, and was sold all over as like this miraculous, incredible thing. And everybody bought in. They were like, oh, it's too good. It's too good to be bad, right? Like, it's just, this is amazing. This is incredible. We love it. We love Teflon. In fact, if you like Google like old Teflon ads, it's amazing. It's always a group of like 60s women, and they're like, right, they just love this thing. And so they love this. But in the 2000s, as everything started to explode and everything came out into the light, they concluded that believe it or not, C8 does cause cancers. And it does actually create birth defects. And it does actually destroy the kidney and the liver, and it will never degrade on its own. This is why it was really useful on tanks and on guns. It never falls apart. It never rots. It never destroys. It just stays forever. In fact, they estimate that they estimate that even in thousands of years, C8 will still be intact. Now, here's what's even crazier, because it was used so widely, and because it doesn't get destroyed, and it gets passed, they estimate that 99.7% of Americans have Teflon in their blood. Right? Now this blows my mind, because I hope that you should be upset by this. Like, I'm upset by this. I'm furious by this. This bothers me. This upsets me that there was a poison released into the public, and it was well known that it was dangerous. And the people who knew that it was dangerous did absolutely nothing about it. And they let it go, and the effects of it went on to affect almost everybody. Can you imagine being in that 0.03%? Like, so healthy. But right, it goes on to wreak havoc on everybody. This little thing that was just in, it was in that state, and it was a long time ago, and it was with those people, and it's not that big of a deal. And if you were here last week, I hope you know where I'm going with this. Because I think most of us should be somewhat upset by the idea that poison was left alone for so long that it's ruined almost everyone. But now we get into the conversation about sin. And I'm convinced that sin is an even greater poison. It actually does more damage. It actually is much more lethal. It affects many more people. It affects the 0.03% too. Sin is widespread. It goes everywhere. It destroys everything it touches. It doesn't die. It's never satisfied. And it just keeps gnawing and gnawing and gnawing until it is brought into the presence of Jesus and destroyed. That's it. And here's the deal. Here's the deal. We talked last week in our series called Fight Club about how it is that Jesus wants us to deal with sin. And Jesus knew that we would have an issue, we'd have a very real issue with sin, especially with other Christians. That, believe it or not, Christians aren't perfect. If you're a Christian and you know that you are not perfect, would you just raise your hand? Okay, all right, this is good. That's good. That's good. That's solid. The rest of you are liars. That's it. Or not Christian. Both are whatever. All right, so, but here's the deal. Here's the deal. Last week we talked about this idea that Jesus says, if there are believers if there's a believer that you know, that you see that's in sin, that does something wrong, you go to them. And you go to them, and what we used the word last week called discreet, right? And I know that freaked some of you out. You're like, man, I didn't come to learn words. All right, so discreetly, right? And it's the idea that, hey, I go quietly. I'm not trying to blow anybody up. I'm not trying to put people on blast, right? Like I'm not going up to Sean and being like, hey, Sean, you're filthy, man. You're a filthy liar, and I want to let you know because I love you in Jesus. Y'all see that? Dirtbag. All right, no, that's not what we do. What we do is we have the discreet conversation. And here's the deal. If Sean responds, actually, in that conversation, Sean was rebuking me, so it was good. It was really good. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. If I respond, if I go, hey, Sean, I'm sorry, man. I'm going to make it right. Will you forgive me? And in that moment, we win. Both of us win. It's a victory for God's kingdom. And we get to go on. But sometimes somebody's going to come to me and be like, hey, Josh, you were a jerk. And I'm going to be like, shut your mouth. And they're going to be like, all right, I'm going to give you another chance. And then what Jesus says to do in Matthew 18, he says, go to them first time, go to them discreetly, go to them privately, have a conversation, say, hey, I see sin in you. And then he says, go and bring somebody with you. Bring a witness, bring a couple witnesses, bring some people who can be unbiased, who can be impartial, who can look at the facts of the situation and be like, all right, hey, this is good, this is not good. And if the person who did wrong listens to it and they go, hey, you know what? I didn't see it before. Now I see it. I'm so sorry. Win. It's a win-win. But sometimes that doesn't work. And tonight I want to help you see how this plays out in a story in Scripture. If you got a Bible, go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We're gonna camp out in there for a little bit. So here's the deal. If you've never read 1 Corinthians before, it's a letter. It was a letter written, I think in the 60s or 70s CE, right? Like not like 1960s, right? Like the actual 60s. All right. So and it was written by a guy named Paul. He's writing to a church that was in a city called Corinth. Not Mississippi, Corinth, like Turkey. And so he's writing to Corinth, and he's already gotten a letter from them. And here's kind of the setup. They wrote Paul a letter, and they were like, hey, we got some stuff going on in our church. What are your thoughts, Paul? Now, Paul is, not only is he a writer of the Bible, he's a church leader, he's an apostle, so he's in a very unique place, and he's written to about a very unique, that's a good word for it, situation. Yeah, I like that. All right, it's a very unique situation. And here's the deal. let's just read it. You already started. You already started reading it. Okay, Paul says this. I can hardly believe the report about the sexual immorality going on among you, something that even pagans don't do. I'm told that a man in your church is living in sin with his stepmother. Okay, now just so you understand what's going on, by saying he's living with his stepmom in sin, it doesn't mean that they're like illegally booting Netflix. It means they're Netflix and chilling, okay? And so this is, I'm glad I spelled that out because maybe you didn't catch that. So this is really the situation. This is the situation, is that there's a guy in the church in some sort of sexual relationship with his stepmom. And this is, what I love it. All right, you guys, this is so good. Okay, here's why this is great. Because almost every single one of you went, ew, right? Like, there's just like a natural, you go, ew. And this is Paul's reaction. He was like, guys, not even unbelievers are cool with that. Like non-Christians are like, oh, gross, dog. But here's the thing. I think this is so telling for us because sexual sin is a weird one. In fact, in our culture, we're almost really lenient about sexual sins. Like we're very not bothered by sexual sins. Most sexual sins, we're like, yeah, you know what? Don't even worry about it, right? Like I remember a college class, and I remember the class. I remember where I sat in that class. It was the largest classroom on my university campus. There was almost 150 plus students in this one class at the same time with me. And I remember the professor coming out and going, "Hey, today we're gonna talk about pornography, and I'm just going to assume that everyone in this audience regularly watches porn. So let's keep going." That's how she started our lecture. And I was like, wait, what? Like, excuse me? But here's what's crazy. The reaction, yeah, I know that there was like pockets of you who were like, oh my goodness. But can I tell you, in my public university class, that was not the reaction. The class didn't go, oh my goodness, our sensibilities have been ruined. No. What they said in that place was, and the assumption was, hey, you know what? This sexual sin is actually really okay in the culture. Don't even worry about that, right? Let's just pretend like that's normal and move on. In fact, sexual sin has been normalized in so many ways in our culture. So I really think that this should be really helpful to us. Verse 2, Paul says this: "You are so proud of yourselves, but you should be mourning in sorrow and shame." What is it that you think happened where a church could have somebody who's like a member, who's like part, who's like in small groups, who's like regular, like they show up often, like they're here like every week, every other week, right? They're regular part of, maybe they serve, like they're part of the teams, but they're also like in an awkwardly sexual relationship with their stepmom. Like what's that situation like? And why is it that the church was like, cool? And why is Paul mad? And I think the issue is a misunderstanding of what it means to be a Christian with sin. if I were to ask a group of people, like I could pick any, if I could just pick like a chunk of people, any group of people, if I walked into Publix right now and was like, hey, everybody in the store, come here. Let me ask you a question. Is Jesus more about being kind and overlooking somebody's sin or convicting and condemning them about our sin? I imagine if I just grabbed any random group of people, got them in a circle and said, hey, which one do you think is more Jesus? Everybody's going to answer kind and overlook it, right? Like, I feel pretty safe about that bet. I'd put money on that, but I don't gamble because I think it's wrong. So here's the deal. That was subtle, all right? It was just, that was some, for some of you taking notes, like, oh, okay, new. All right, so here's the deal. I think tonight we need to reset and reframe our minds to be about Jesus. Because Jesus is the most forgiving and most loving person you could ever encounter. And the Spirit of God is the most merciful and gentle and kind that you could ever encounter anywhere. However, He is also the most righteous and most holy. He is also the most perfect and the one most put off and offended by and injured by sin. And He is the one who, more than any other, knows the poison that sin is and loves to see it removed and put to death and not left alone. See, if sin is a poison, then it's actually unkind to leave it alone, right? Now, I gave an illustration to our middle schoolers the other day, and they did not answer this correctly, so please help me. Imagine you are in the lunchroom, or whatever, you're in a restaurant, you're in Three Peppers, and they're walking around and they're spraying stuff, right? They're cleaning, and then they accidentally put like the bleach like right near your friend's drink, okay? And so they just like set it down and they're like scrubbing away, and your friend isn't looking, and they grab that bleach, and it just feels like their cup, right? They're talking to you, and they're about to take a, and you see it says like bleach. It's like hazard, right? Like you see, like you can't read it, but you know that if you could read it, it'd be like immediately call the hospital, right? Like you know that's what's coming toward the mouth. And if you see that move, do you be like, hey, I'm not gonna tell him. I don't want to offend them. Like I know that like I know it's not good for them, but like they think it is, right? Like no. All right. So this is what I have to ask it. How many of you would warn your friend about drinking bleach? Okay. All right, y'all are decent. Okay, so, all right, you're pretty decent. I saw a couple, like, entire rows that were like, nah, let's see what plays out. But here's the deal. If sin is poison, and you know it's poison, and you know its effect, you know what it does, and you know that it causes death, and you know it brings destruction, and you see it inside of somebody that you love, isn't it necessary and right and good to bring them to the awareness that sin is poison? Isn't it important that we call that out and we say, hey, no. This is more destructive than you know. You're drinking bleach and you can't see it. It's like when everybody had COVID and you lost your sense of smell and you could eat anything. I loved watching people like on Instagram just biting onions. Right? Because they can't taste it. They're like, yeah. And here's the deal. Often sin masks its odor. And so the first bite and the first taste and the first little sip don't feel like the sickness that will come with it later. And so here's what happens. You have a group in a city called Corinth who think that they're being like Jesus. They genuinely think, man, we're just loving him like Jesus. We're just leaving him. We told him it was bad. We were like, hey, man, this is kind of icky. And he was like, nah, it's good. He was like, I just love who I love, He was just like, hey, it doesn't hurt you, so like, just let me be. And they said, you know what? Okay. Like, what do we argue with that? And Paul comes back in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 6. He says, your boasting about this is terrible. Don't you realize that this sin is like a little yeast that spreads through the whole batch of dough? I don't know if any of you have ever like baked a loaf of bread before. Anybody just like, yeah, okay, mad props. Okay. I've tried to bake sourdoughs multiple times, failed every time. I know some of you got tips, but I don't need them. I'm just going to buy it. Okay, so, but here's the deal. If you are uninitiated, if you are unfamiliar, yeast is pretty tiny. In fact, it's a bacteria. It's really small. You can get a bunch of bacteria yeast together so you can see it and you can be like, that's yeast. But it's bacteria. It's really small. And you don't need a whole lot to affect an entire loaf of bread. In fact, a little bit will work its way through the entire bread. Listen, you've probably baked enough things or seen enough baked things to know in your life that you've never had to spread out the yeast in the mixture. It usually finds its way in. Like most of you have never like baked a muffin and you were like, man, I'm hoping that like one half of this doesn't miss yeast, right? You've never seen like a muffin come out and only like half of it popped and you're like, that's the yeastless side. Right? You've never seen this. Do you know why? Because a little bit works through the entire thing. And what he warns the church is, he says, guys, listen. A little bit of sin looks so innocent and it looks so tiny and it looks so small and it honestly is cute. It's like cute. You're like, oh, they like each other. and Paul goes, no, guys. Sin spreads. Sin is going to eventually, if you leave any of it alone, you leave any sin alone, it's going to grow. It's going to consume something else. It's going to spread. Sin is destructive and hungry. And here's the thing. Inside of God's church, inside of people who say, hey, I believe in Jesus, we should be a people of grace and mercy. We should be a people of kindness. We should love people. You know what I find? I find that often the people who are really good at bringing conviction and condemnation, like the people who are really good at being like, hey, that's sin, are often also uncoupled with love and mercy and grace and tenderness, okay? Which are requirements of following Jesus, okay? And I find that the people that the people who often are so naturally like merciful and kind and thoughtful and forgiving are often also very much uncoupled from the strong conviction that says, guys, this is right and this is wrong. And the people of God need to have both of those things. Like it's not one or the other. It's not like, hey, I'm going to be nice about sin. I'm going to just like let it do its thing. No. We have to love each other enough to be like, man, this is destructive to you. But we also have to do it in a way that comes from a heart of love and care and mercy. We're going to talk about where that comes from next week. But I need to explain something to you. That quite often, Christians allow sin in the lives of other believers because they think it's being more kind and more Christian. But what ends up happening is that sin ends up corrupting and ruining and destroying. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a pattern over and over and over, where there's a small group of people, like a church small group, and somebody starts a sin that no one addresses. And it could be anything. I mean, one of the most dangerous that I see is like a gossip, right? So you got this small group, and they're all Christians, but they just start talking bad about something, and week after week, this continues, and no one really puts an end to it because it's like, I don't want to, maybe that's just their personality, like, I'm just not going to, like, that's just who they are, right? And then let this thing run, and you play this out over a year, and you watch that entire small group disintegrate. You watch this entire group of people say, you know what, I'm so hurt by the church. I'm so hurt by Christians. I don't want any part of this anymore. You know what, I'm sick of Christians. I love God, but I don't like his people. And can I tell you something? The church is absolutely the place where we come broken. Where we come knowing, God, I don't have it all together. God, I need you. God, I'm a sinner. God, Paul even writes, Paul, the guy who's writing this, Paul even writes, he says, I'm the worst sinner that's ever lived. He's like, listen, guys, I get it. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm the worst sinner that's ever lived. I'm also just interested in making sure that everybody I love inside the body of Christ is growing in Jesus and not consuming poison. Is that fair? And I think there's got to be this place where we recognize that if we want to follow Jesus and love Jesus and chase Jesus, that we can't be satisfied with sin in the camp. We can't be satisfied with sin in our brothers and sisters. We can't be satisfied with that. We can't call it okay because sin destroys. What happened in Corinth was somebody came to this guy and said, hey man, this is not okay. And he said, no, leave me alone. And it sounds like they brought some other people into the mix and said, hey, this is not okay. And he said, no, I'm going to do what I want to do. And they got to this point where they write Paul and they say, Paul, what do we do from here? And he says in verse 5, this is going to sound so harsh. He says this, you must throw this man out and hand him over to Satan so that his sinful nature will be destroyed and he himself will be saved on the day the Lord returns. I'm going to be honest. I'm pretty soft. And so I would never say those words to anyone ever if the Bible didn't have them. Does that make sense? Like I'm not the guy who's running around and be like, yo, let's throw him outside for Satan to eat his body, right? Like that's not like a normal, natural thing for me. And I think some of you can vibe with that. But here's the deal. Jesus says in Matthew 18, listen, if you get somebody to a place where everybody has come and said, hey, this is sin, and you're just leaving it alone, and you're just letting it be, if that person decides to continue in sin, what it actually means is that they are no longer a follower of Jesus. Like if you wanted to know if somebody is a follower of Jesus or not, that's the moment. The moment where they're confronted by their sin and everybody says, hey, this is an issue, and they go, no, I'm not going to see it. And what Paul says is harsh, but I'm going to tell you why there's something kind in it next week. I don't want you to miss next week. We're going to unpack this, but I need you to understand something, that Paul is willing to love people enough to point out their sin, to care for them. And as people who, listen, I know this is like a tough one. If you're going to actually leave Vox tonight and try to live this out, this is a tough one. I get it. And Paul's going to end this chapter and he's going to say, listen, we do not judge unbelievers. That's not our job. It's not our role. Like you don't have to walk through your school hallway and go, immoral, cussing, you just use God's name in vain, you're a thief, right? Like you don't do that. You would get beat up before you went from one class to another. You would die every day. Paul literally says the only way you could do that, if you had to judge the world, Paul goes, actually, you would have to leave planet Earth. Like there's just no winning, right? You just can't. What we can do, though, is with those who agree with us that Jesus is king, and with those who agree with us that we belong to a family together, and those who agree with us that God's word is true and good and it's the right way to live, those of us who agree on that, we should also agree together that sin is not okay, and we've got to be willing to help one another.